Welcome to the Practical Spirituality series. The purpose of this series is to share what I have read and learned about how your spirituality can function in everyday life. I like to call it practical spirituality. My goal is to give you some ideas on things like how to acknowledge conflicts and deal with them, how to let negative thoughts wash off of you, and how we attract the right people to associate with. I'm going to review systems that are used for this purpose as well as individual practices. I hope these insights prove beneficial to you and your family. All right, good morning. This is the fourth and last presentation on this Lenten series. And I want to just to kind of summarize real quickly where we've gone, where we've been, and where we are now. The two main parts that I wanted to really hit on as I looked at all this literature is this whole idea of outside in versus inside out. That the inside out part was all the authors that we talked about. That's what they were about. It's all about inside out. And the other part then was the power of choice. Those were the two things that I just tracked through everything. So I know we got off on some tangents here and there. I wanted you to be able to understand some of the background. But when you look at all of them, they all stumbled across that. So they were all, so that was somewhere in their literature. And as I was telling the TED, and some of them actually stumbled across this, and they almost like the man with the buried treasure. They almost didn't know what they had. They had something that was pretty spectacular, but then they went on to do whatever they were doing. So this last one, again, is the culmination of that. And again, as I've said before, for me, the whole concept of grace there's nothing else like it. And it's even in the church. For whatever reason, I think the church is afraid of grace because if we really talked about grace too much, people would say, why would I go to church? God already loves me and all the rest. And a lot of the church, we've taken grace and watered it down or put a little legalism in there. And once you do that, it's not grace anymore. And so that's what I was tracking with these authors and these people, is this concept of there is truly this graceful element to them. I want to get on to a guy named Sid Banks. Sid Banks is this guy who was he was a ninth grade education, a welder who goes to this conference is on marriage, and and the whole conference is about talking about all the things you don't like about your partner. And he just says, and they were going back and forth, and he just said, this is just awful, and I'm terrible. And he was leaving, and he met this therapist, and the therapist asked him what he was doing. He said, I'm leaving the conference. This is not good for me. And the therapist agreed with him. And then Banks went on to talk about how insecure he was, and kept going on and on and on. And the therapist said to him, that's just hogwash. And Banks said that when that happened, it just hit him that there was something else going on. And so he has this incredible experience where he doesn't sleep for several days, and he gets this he compares himself to like Newton. It wasn't his idea, but he stumbled across something that he felt was just true about the mind, about the soul. And he began to have these workshops where he lived. He was a very shy man, and people just started showing up to the point where Tibetan monks were coming over, and people, he didn't know how they found out about him, but they were coming to listen to this spirituality he was talking about. And this guy, George Pransky, said that he was transformed from this shy man to somebody who just had this uncommon sense of well-being. He just had something about him. And I spent my second sabbatical listening to his tapes and all. And if you don't listen to him the right way, you just kind of go, I don't really get it. Because Banks' whole thing is once you really understand these three principles he's talking about, you'll have a change. You just have this change. But if you're looking for a method, you're going to miss it. It's not about a method. It's just about understanding that just like gravity, these three things he talked about are just these principles that as you begin to just let them, if you will, float across your soul, you begin to understand something on a very deep level. So he said, one genuine insight. He would have these kinds of statements like this where you go, they're very mystical. But he says there's three concepts. The first is mind. Mind is the universal energy that animates all of life. and that is within all of us. In other words, we are all made in the image of God. So we have within us this wisdom, this source, this place that is in all of us, that is always there, and it's not ours, but it never leaves us. And then he said consciousness was the ability to be aware of one's life. So consciousness is this part where we bring in our ideas and our senses about things, thoughts that we have, and it energizes them. And the other is thought. And his contention is that thought, everyone has been imbued with this idea, this gift of thought, and that basically everything that we experience has to happen from thought first. In other words, the way you know things is by thought. So for instance, this cup is a cup, but the way you know it's a cup is you have to think it first. And so therefore, everything comes that way. Another way to look at it would be that mind has been likened to the electricity running a movie projector. The thought are the images on the film, and consciousness is the light and the projector that throws the images onto a screen. So these were his three basic principles that he just sticks with. And whenever you hear a speech by him or a talk, it's all he does. He just says the same thing over and over and over again. So these are all the different groups that tried to take his principles and apply them. They really blew up in terms of this kind of newer psychology, because it wasn't about intervention. It was just about working with people on understanding this innate health that they already had. He was adverse to using some of these things because his whole deal was you just got to stick with the three principles. That's it. So any idea about trying to move them around and make them more palatable, he felt that they lost some of their energy. So it was all about the three: mind, consciousness, thought, over and over. So he felt they compromised the original nature of the three principles, and whenever you hear Banks, he will just go back and just keep talking about the principles, and you'll find that if you listen to him for a bit, you just begin to have this sense of very much of a deep contentment or peace. You don't do anything for these benefits, you just understand that these principles are always in play. That was his deal over and over again, that this is the way the mind works, is these three principles. And so he has this one great tape where he's going on and he says, if you're driving along the car and you hear, and this is you have a good feeling about this, take the tape out and throw it out the window and just stick with that good feeling. That'll teach you everything you need to know. That his whole idea was this idea that when you begin to listen to something and you get this sense of peace, just stick with that. And that's the whole deal. But oftentimes what we try to do is try to find a method or whatever else, and he says, you'll miss it. Just when you find it, just stick with it and just let it go. So the universal mind, Paul talks about therefore we have the mind of Christ, that within us is this capacity we all have to think as Christ thought. That was Paul's statement. And this lies in with what he's talking about. There's a source of thought, a formless space where the soul is uncontaminated by anything that is happening to it. That's actually a statement by Anthony de Mello. He says the same thing, that there's within us this source. It's always there. It's like a spring that's gurgling up all the time, never goes away. It's far deeper than our thoughts, emotions, and sensations, and deeper doesn't capture it. It's just beyond. It's wider, it's broader, it's more content than anything else. It's always there. It's just constantly a part of who we are. And so he calls this the universal mind or impersonal mind. It's constant and unchangeable. So this mind it's always there. It's always going along. It doesn't change. Can never go away. And then he calls, meanwhile, the personal mind is in a perpetual state of change. So this is that part we talked about, the 70,000 ideas that come through your head. So you have these almost two minds, but Banks would say that they are not different. So they're not two separate minds. They just, that they can sync. You can allow them to sync. And you do that by, but again, not kind of chasing your tail, that this will just automatically come when we settle down. But this mind is always about us. And again, that's the two minds that they're not separate. So this again is one of Banks' statements. All you have to know that everything is created from thought, and you don't have to know anything else. And this was really important to him. It's just that everything is about thought. Every experience that we have is a thought. You have to think it first. So you can have experiences, but something has to happen in your mind to be able to relay that to who you are, to experience. So So again, all mental states are self-created through thought. Any place that we are, it all begins with thought. And so his contention then is that everything is subjective, because if it's all about thought, depending on the time of day, all the different things happening, we have different thoughts about same experiences or same people, that they change. And Pransky says, in 5 to 10 years, your thoughts on most topics will likely change. Something you believe now, except for very few things, you'll come back and look at it later, and it'll be different. So that life is subjective. In other words, it's all coming through these filters that we have, and it's all about how you're thinking about something. So again, when we understand that a thought is just a thought, just a creation of formless energy, the iron grip of the ego can have on us begins to lessen. I mean, this is the idea that if it's just about your thinking about something, then if you begin to really just let that wash across you, then life doesn't have to be so serious, because these are just thoughts. And so what he would say was that if we get a feel for that, then when you have thoughts that you think are really important, and again, we talked about low moods last week, that once we settle down a bit, this other mind that's already within us will begin to go ahead and take over. And this is really, if you think about most meditation, labyrinth, or anything else, all these practices do the same thing. They're trying to engage this cognitive part that wants to grind through things, and it's hoping that this other mind will come up. And all good spirituality is all about that. It's all about just settling down. When we settle down, there's this other space that will take over. So Banks almost puts this into a mathematical formula about these three parts, but all of us have this. There's this space within us that's constantly full of wisdom, constantly seeing things on a much deeper, broader basis. So understanding this, if you get a feel for that, understanding this idea about thought, that first thing that comes, is a sense of humility, because our ego begins to lose its grip, it begins to go away, and we begin to get in touch with something that's much deeper, much beyond us. Banks was kind of funny. A lot of different stories about him. The only one that I ever read that he got mad about something is he left a conference one time because he had been talking about this, and he heard two people talking together, and one person said to the other, well, my mind, my impersonal mind, I think is deeper than yours. And he walked away. He just left the conference because he said they just all that talking and they didn't get it, because that's the whole point. It's not about us. This is about something that's beyond us, and this whole concept of mind and thought. So thoughts and feelings, and we talk about in church every Sunday about the peace of God which bypasses all understanding. I mean, think about those words. I mean, this is a lot of this stuff that Banks was doing just meshed up with what we know in our spirituality in the church. And so every thought, therefore, carries a feeling. That when we have a thought, it comes along with some kind of feeling. And we can get mixed up about the feelings with Banks' deal. And Pransky was really big on this. He was the one that kind of took this a little bit deeper. But they become alive, whether negative or positive, through the power of thought. So that, basically, we have a thought, the feeling comes along with it, but sometimes we can get mixed up about what the feeling means. And that the feeling really was a perfect system for feedback on the clarity of our thinking. In other words, when we have feelings of contentment and at peace, that's really telling us that our thought is in a good space. When we're anxious about things, that's the system really kind of saying, hey, we're kind of out of whack here, because the brain doesn't know, if you will, when it's thinking well and when it's not. And we gave that example last week. You wake up in the middle of the night, start writing things down, think you have great ideas, look at them the next morning and go, not so good. But it's the anxiousness. So listening to your anxiousness, when we're in a space where we're really in a space of well-being, that's a suggestion or a signal that our thoughts are really in a good space. When we're anxious, that's telling us the thoughts are not in a good space. And so the feeling was really sort of, if you will, this barometer for where we are. So by listening to your feelings, you can understand where you are. And that's that whole part we talked about before about letting things pass when we're anxious. And his contention is if we just identify a thought as this is just an anxious space I'm in, and you let that pass, this other mind would begin just to well back up again. It always wants to well back up, but it keeps getting suppressed by the way we think. So again, they serve, all feelings then serve as a mirror for our state of well-being in a given moment. That they're basically letting us know how we're doing in any given spot in time. And then consciousness is the third one. This is the gift of awareness. And so consciousness is the thing that then begins to help this thought generate in some kind of reality. So consciousness makes thought appear real to each person in a given moment. It's what gives some meat to the bones, if you will. As soon as a thought comes into our consciousness, all senses are utilized to form an idea around the thought. So everything that we have in terms of past history, all the rest is all rushing in to help form what this thought's going to turn into or what it looks like for us. And each person, again, in a given day or a given time, it could be different, but that's constantly happening. So thoughts, in combination with consciousness, create our experience of any given moment. The two of them, when they merge together, create what we know about something. This is one of Banks' more intense statements, but he would say that everyone in a mental institution is in the middle of mental health and they don't know it. That, again, within them, all of us, is this sense of mental health. It's always there, but they don't have the, if you will, this idea of how it happens, and so that's where we get mixed up. But it's always there. We have innate mental health within us that gets lost. So again, what gravity is to the physical world, they would say, the ones who practice this would say the three principles are to our psychological worlds. That this is just it's just a metaphysical principle of how spirituality works. And again, this is where I told you about Banks. No one has greater access to spiritual wisdom than anyone else. And so that's one of the great misnomers if you think about spirituality, is we say, well, I wish I could be like that or like this other person. And Banks would just say over and over again, that's not true. Everyone has this innate sense within them all the time, and that it's just a matter of letting go. And the more we let go, the more we can access what was already ours. But that would be the same thing for grace. If you think about grace, it's always inside out, not outside in. There's nothing that you can do to receive God's love because it's already been given. That is just a common tenet of grace, and that's what that Banks has hit upon here, is that you already have everything you need. It's always there. It's already been given. It can't be taken away. You can't earn it. You can just realize what you already have. So again, that mental health is a resting state or a default setting of the mind, that when we go back, that anything that whenever we get too carried away and we're adding things on, but when we stop and just go all the way over, we have this. And we would say the same thing about experience the presence of God, that every human being in life has had moments where they just experience a presence of God that they can't really explain. We've had it, we might not know how to get there. Banks would say, the way you get there is understanding these three principles. You understand them, you'll get them. There is no intervention, anything else. It's just understanding them and carrying them around and trying them out. And what you begin to do as you try them out is you begin to see, and I will say this, if you start reading some of this material and just let it sit for a minute, it's strange what happens. You do get a sense of just, I find myself, I go to yoga and things like that, and they're always teaching us how to breathe more slowly. You read this stuff, and it's funny. The funniest thing, I find myself going, and you just start settling down. It's very odd. But again, where I've always gotten in trouble with it is if I ever try to figure out a methodology behind it, because Banks would say over and over, it's not about any of that. It's just about understanding this is the way it works. And when you get it, it comes. If you try to take it, manipulate it, turn it into something else, it doesn't work very well. So again, when one chooses to take thoughts more lightly, the mind quiets down and positive feelings emerge spontaneously. That's what I found whenever I read these things. And when you begin just not to take your thoughts so seriously, whatever they are, they're just thoughts. We have memories of things. They're just memories. They're not happening anymore. We give weight to things. How many times do I talk to people who are working on forgiveness of somebody? And I get that. There's a lot of painful stuff there, but there's this tough part, because you try to tell people, look, if you don't forgive somebody, you're hurting yourself, and people will get that, but I just don't know how to do it. And this provides a methodology in the sense of understanding it's a thought, and thoughts are not to be taken that seriously. They're part of the way we experience things, but again, they come and they go. And if you think about the 70,000 again, you don't like one, let it go, and another one will come. But eventually, as you settle down, this mind or this higher level of thought begins to take over. So results of living into the three principles. We are able to live life knowing that our reality is created from the inside of us, and outer circumstances do not create our feelings, perceptions, or experiences. This is what Paul was saying when he says, I have learned the secret to be content in all things. He doesn't say about all things, he says in all things. And that is exactly what Banks was talking about. I have learned to be content in all things. We can't change the events that we go through, but we do have this capacity to be content. Remember, Paul wrote that from jail. He'd just been beaten and flogged, and he's in jail, and he's writing these things, and he wrote some of his most inspirational stuff when his exterior was in really bad situation, but his interior was okay, and that's what he's talking about. I've learned to be content in it. And oftentimes we're trying to be content about things. And when we try to be content about things, we give up all our control or all our power. It's about just being able to be content in it. I love there was an old Gary Larson's cartoon about this guy, the devil standing there next to his henchman, and this guy's got his wheelbarrow, and the flames of hell are all over the place, and he's got a big wheelbarrow full of boulders, and he's whistling away, and Satan turns to the henchman and goes, I get the feeling we're not getting to this guy, you know. And that's really what good spirituality is about, is just being able to go through life, and again, we're going to experience, we can't control what comes upon us, but we can control how we go through things. Not what we go through, but how we go through it. So again, the insight into the principles uncovers an innate well-being and unlocks the full potential within each individual. We would call this grace. I mean, this is, again, and this is when I've looked all over in terms of theology for a long time, very few places really get that idea of just there's something already here. Everything else says you got to do this, you got to get more reading, all the rest. I find people all the time saying, I wish I knew more about the Bible. And I always want to tell them, like, you don't need to know anything more about the Bible, honestly. When I was in seminary, we had courses on studying the nature of sand in different regions, and it's just a bunch of stuff, at the end of the day. Ultimately, if you can just find something that works for you and understand this concept and let it sink in. That's all you need. You really don't need. Everything else will come, but understanding more about individual passages is not really the key. If we don't know how things work, the memories will have the capacity to haunt us. These practitioners and Banks would say that if you understand how it works, you can access this innate well-being within you. If you don't, you're constantly going to go through being haunted and thinking that the events you go through control you. Because, again, they would say the event is really your feeling and your thought. It's not about the event itself. It's how you see the event. And that goes back to what Covey told us. Remember the story about the man on the train. Once the man had lost his wife, and once Covey realized that, he saw the whole situation different. It's a great example of how you're thinking about something is more important than the actual event itself. Again, so if you multiply this, and there is a major difference in quality of life. When I was first reading Banks and listening to Banks, it was kind of interesting because at first you kind of go, I don't get it. What's so big here? Why is this such earth-shattering news? But the reality of it was this stuff stacks up. In other words, as you go through life and you start thinking that your memories, and then there's events that we have with people, and what were they thinking about that, and all the rest of that. Within a day, you can imagine like how many things stack up where you start thinking it's about you and it's something I've done wrong or you've done wrong or whatever else. What really happens here, though, is that over the course of a day, you lose all this stuff. So it's just a daily thing where it gets better and better slightly each day. But over the course of, again, if you were to just apply these three principles, I'd say for a month, I would almost guarantee you that you will come out with a sense of quietness and well-being that you didn't have before you started, because this stuff stacks up all day long. We're constantly having interactions with people, and if we don't understand the map, we're going to continue to get lost. So this is his last statement. I'll just let you read that for yourself. But this was his statement here. Was what he was saying here, I think, is that, again, there's no methodology. This is just understanding this concept of how your soul works. If you understand how your soul works, then it's yours and it's no one else. And that's for me, that's the whole idea. Then if you go back to grace, grace is there's no such thing as even pure grace. There's just grace. And that what happens, what Banks was saying here was that you got to get this for yourself. And that if you find some methodology, then it's going to be someone else's idea. You just have to take these three concepts, let them sink in for a bit, and then you'll discover what you need to discover for you. No one else will have to teach it to you, and it won't be something it'll be somebody else's that you borrowed. It will be your own experience. So he was really big on this. And again, I've searched the internet for years and years looking at all his tapes. They all do the same thing. I mean, you got this he speaks in the Scottish brogue. It's hard to understand him sometimes, but as he's going along, all he keeps talking about is, here's the facts. This is the way this works. It's almost like Newton was saying over and over again, gravity works this way, and just sticks with it the entire time. But his whole point there is that you begin to find your own reality, and as you do that, it does change. And again, you can see sometimes in video series when he's talking, you'll see the light bulb will just go off. People will go, oh, I get it. And that's it. That's all. And he would say that's all you need. You find one time where that works, that's it. So again, this is the conclusion of